await final election results from the Independent Electoral Commission, we continue our focus on the low voter turnout during the 2021 local government election. The IEC concedes that the shorter period than usual to prepare for the polls resulted in some voters not being able to cast their ballots. We ventilate this issue a little bit more with the director of the Institute for Futures Research, Dr. Morné Moster. Dr. Moster, thank you very much for your patience with us. So let's just give a brief introduction just for the purpose of a viewer who may not be familiar with the work that you do. What is the Institute for Futures Research about? Very shortly for us, please.
The Institute for Futures Research is essentially concerned with the kind of decisions that people make for the longer term. We're interested in how the minds of decision makers work and what the more likely decisions might be, especially as it relates to creating alternative futures.
In terms of creating alternative futures, I had the pleasure of being in the same room with Dr. Njeri, one of your own in Nairobi, and she presented scenarios, speculative genres of utopia, Africa utopia and Africa dystopia. Utopia being the perfect state, dystopia where there's chaos and not all the way there. So when you speak of being in the minds of decision makers or exploring the minds of decision makers, let's take a look at the local government elections. Utopia first. Let's start with some good news.
Yes, of course there have been very many stories, voter apathy and the rise of Action SA, the smaller parties and therefore the natural implication into the future of coalitions. But to my mind, the most significant thing that we're observing here is that we have seen a mindset shift in the minds of voters in South Africa. And in my view, the most dominant mindset shift has been to move from dogmatism, from ideology, to a kind of political pragmatism. And that shift has had enormous repercussions in this election.
Let's take a look at the local government elections. Dystopia.
Yeah, I think that for some parties, they've seen a utopia. And for others, of course, they've seen a dystopia. I think for the ANC, we've just heard the defensiveness from Mr. Mantashe and others. It has been dystopian. So, in other words, when we observe the future, whether it's utopian or dystopian, and of course, both of those are really two extremes that almost never occur, the reality is when we look at these different vantage points, we see these different mindsets, and they all experience a different reality. For Mr. Mashava, I'm sure he's seeing a utopia, and for some areas, at least in the ANC, it is dystopian in nature. But of course, my reading of this election, this mindset shift, which, by the way, is also informed by some research that we've done on a mindset index that measures the extent to which people move on their mindsets, that major mindset shift has been one in which, when we look at dimensions of enactment, the kind of action that we're expecting ruling parties to take, has moved from dogmatism to pragmatism. In terms of how voters think of reality, it has moved from idealism, a kind of liberation idealism, to a political realism. In terms of how people think about people themselves, I think we've seen a shift from a kind of benevolent autocracy, I say with some sensitivity about the ANC, to a meritocracy. We will now measure parties on their results. We've moved from what we call institutionalism, a celebration of the ANC just because it is the ANC, to a humanism. In other words, a greater focus on the needs of people in the system. On agency, and I'm almost done here with the dimensions of the mindset index, on agency we've seen a shift moving to the self, my interests, my concerns, my realities on the ground, which of course local elections are all about. And then in terms of expectation, we've seen a dramatic shift from a kind of idealism based on rhetoric to a realism with practical needs. And then finally, on the growth model, what do we see? How do we see this expanding into the future? We've seen a shift from a protectionist mindset of the ANC to an expansionist mindset to include other parties, smaller parties, newer players, even a few independents. So these are all shifts in what you might describe as the mindset index of the South African voter.
You speak of people moving from idealism to political realism. I came across a gentleman today who reminisced on the days of old. He's from the former Bophuthatswana, and he was talking about how the old regime would clean the roads and, you know, they had jobs at least, which is what some, you know, elder people in the country feel, that the older regime had taken care of them, as opposed to what we see now. In the future, you always looking at future scenarios. What is it that the young people of today, modern South Africa, will say about this country?
I think we're seeing a new mindset emerging in a new generation. And in fact, if you look at elections all over the world, many political parties, including in the rest of Africa, by the way, have recognized the power of this mindset shift of the new generation. The ANC, if I may be a little bit critical for a moment, has been tone deaf to the mindset shift of a younger generation. And so my sense is that younger generations of the future will say that we stayed with ideology, with dogmatism for just far too long. The world has moved on. We've heard even the president, perhaps quoted slightly out of context, arguing that, you know, if the ANC is not voted for, then electricity may never be restored. This reminds one of the kind of leaders in African power states of old that would make comments on society that could almost never be challenged. Well, what did we see in this election? We saw that voters no longer take these kind of expressions at face value. The decision-making is much more discerning, and a new generation is starting to show a new mindset.
Absolutely. Director of the Institute for Futures Research, Dr. Morné Moster, thank you.